Hey guys, welcome to Midcast, an interview series featuring dissenting voices the establishment would rather silence. I'm your host, Manar Muhawish. Today, we'll delve into a new revelation that CrowdStrike, the firm behind the accusation that Russia hacked and stole DNC emails, admitted to Congress that it has no direct evidence that Russia actually stole DNC emails and infiltrated their servers. Thanks in part to the global pandemic that has been dominating headlines, this revelation was not picked up by a single corporate media outlet, the same corporate media that worked diligently to convince the American public that Russia interfered in the 2016 elections to help elect Donald Trump. Now, one investigative journalist, though, Aaron Mate, has done an extraordinary job debunking the RussiaGate narrative since it began, and he joins us today to discuss this new revelation and much more. He's the host of the show Pushback on the Gray Zone. Aaron, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to talk about CrowdStrike, who they are, this revelation that you actually revealed, and why we're only now hearing about this.
Well, we're only now hearing about this because, as is a habit with RussiaGate, bombshell claims are made, and then slowly but surely the countervailing evidence gets revealed later on to undermine it. In this case, it just happened to get revealed nearly 3 years after the testimony was given. And that's because of some infighting between Democrats and Republicans in Congress. But I think probably because Adam Schiff, the head of the House Intelligence Committee, didn't want it released because this testimony and others was very damning for the narrative he helped build for 3 years. So what CrowdStrike is it's a cybersecurity firm, and it was hired by the DNC to help with a breach of its server that it says it discovered in the spring of 2016. And it ended up, CrowdStrike ended up, after an investigation, ended up being the first entity to accuse Russia of hacking the DNC and giving files to Russian intelligence cutouts. And so basically, CrowdStrike is the source, the first source for the underlying crime that has propelled RussiaGate for more than 3 years. Now, what's interesting about CrowdStrike is that it has a sketchy track record when it accused Russia of conducting a hack inside Ukraine using similar software that it says it identified inside the DNC server. It actually had to retract that allegation. So it doesn't actually have, the most spotless track record, and it has deep partisan ties. Its co-founder is a vocal critic of the Russian government. He is a fellow at the Atlantic Council, which is basically an anti-Russia, pro-NATO think tank in Washington, very influential. And its president, Sean Henry, the guy who gave this testimony to Congress, he previously came from the FBI, where he worked very closely with Robert Mueller, who ended up leading the Trump-Russia investigation. And then later on, and actually, meanwhile, during all of this, by the way, Henry was also a national security analyst at MSNBC, the top peddler of RussiaGate.
That's like the main organization that has been peddling this narrative.
It is. Yeah, it is. So you don't exactly have an unbiased source here. And it's strange that, the basis for the allegation that Russia hacked the DNC and stole emails was a private firm with such, deep partisan ties. And, we know that the FBI never got a fully independent access to the DNC server. There have been all these conflicting claims about that. The DNC and CrowdStrike says that the FBI did get it, but FBI officials have said that they didn't. So even exactly what even happened there is unclear. But just the fact that there's such discrepancy between the claims shows that this was not a clean operation, and there was some funny stuff going on. And I think now we're realizing why, because Sean Henry, in his testimony that, again, was delivered in December of 2017, he says on multiple occasions that, these hackers who CrowdStrike alleges are Russian, although I don't see any reason to even accept that claim, but whatever, even if they are, he acknowledges multiple times that CrowdStrike has no evidence that these hackers actually exfiltrated anything from the server, which means they cannot pinpoint when or even whether these hackers actually took the DNC emails off the server. And so if you can't identify when or even whether these emails were taken off the server, how can you so confidently accuse Russia of taking them?
Well, I think this brings up a good point about how if you repeat something, whether it's true or not, if it's a lie, so many times it's going to end up being believed by the general public. And so can you tell us what evidence the intelligence community has claimed to have, and how the media played a role? I mean, you talk about MSNBC. First person that comes to my mind is like Rachel Maddow, who has been this, the most vocal peddler of this RussiaGate narrative. How has the media played a role in pushing this?
Well, the media has played a vital role. It's basically acted as a propaganda organ for the intelligence officials and Democratic Party elites who benefited from RussiaGate and who started it. They've done that for many reasons. It's profitable. MSNBC wasn't doing that great, but it did great because of RussiaGate, because what they were presenting people was this real life spy thriller that was going to, as they were advertising it, bring down a president who, for understandable reasons, a lot of people want to see gone. And so it was exciting. But the problem is it was completely baseless. And the way to keep it going was to basically ignore all the countervailing facts. It's not as if like RussiaGate is just shown to be baseless now. That was pretty obvious from the start that what was keeping it going was cherry-picked claims, disingenuous language from Mueller and the intelligence officials behind this, and selective leaks. And that was obvious to, all the skeptics. But the way the media kept it going was basically they ignored anybody who was making criticism and looking at the actual evidence and just presented a false narrative. And, audiences don't have the time to go fact check everything themselves. And this was the overwhelming narrative that was presented. And so that's how they went along with it. And look, you can see that now. CrowdStrike's made this admission. It comes out. It's publicly released. The only ones to cover it are, outlets like us and Fox News. But Fox News has a partisan interest in covering that because, anything that undermines RussiaGate and shows it to be the scam that it is will obviously help Trump, which is why I was, from a partisan point of view, I was so against it from the start, because I always thought, like, what could be a bigger gift to Trump than to challenge him based on something so stupid and so baseless?
Well, and I think that's what's so interesting about this is that if you did challenge this narrative, if you did question this whole RussiaGate conspiracy, then you would immediately get targeted and attacked as this like Putin minion. But actually what you've done is you've actually showed how this has actually been beneficial to the Trump administration. And how can you explain how that has been beneficial?
Well, I can't think of a bigger gift if you're Trump and his circle. You are overseeing a radical upward transfer of wealth with your tax cuts, and you're undoing regulations. You're pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal. You're ramping up the danger of nuclear war by pulling out of vital nuclear treaties with Russia. You're trying to overthrow governments in Venezuela and Iran and Nicaragua and wherever else. And you're trying to gut Obamacare. You're doing all these horrible things. And meanwhile, what is the main focus of your so-called resistance? Right. It's a conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy theory that you conspired with Russia and that Putin has blackmail leverage over you. And instead of mobilizing people around those issues, your resistance has basically been told to sit on the sidelines and wait for Robert Mueller to do its job, because Robert Mueller, this hero, is going to bring Trump down. I mean, like that was the message of coming from liberal leaders for 3 years. To me, I mean, the most symbolic illustration of this is that there were bigger liberal protests to save Jeff Sessions' job than there were to save the Iran nuclear deal, or to save the Paris Accords, or to even save healthcare, or to oppose Trump's tax cuts. Because there was this concern that if Jeff Sessions was fired, then that would harm Mueller somehow, which is just, so here we are literally rallying to protect the job security of a racist instead of rallying around issues that actually impact people's lives. And, the interest for liberal elites is very obvious. For them, it was great for their ratings. It was profitable for them to have this thing, to be talking about a spy thriller and collusion instead of real issues, because, that just it sells more. And it also was a convenient way, I think more importantly, for liberal elites to avoid any meaningful challenge to their own power and their own privilege, because the lesson of 2016 was that an anti-establishment message wins. That's what Trump ran on. He painted himself as being someone who was going to drain the swamp. He even spoke out against, military intervention abroad in Syria and Libya, and that resonated. So the obvious answer for Democrats was if Trump won by falsely presenting himself as being anti-establishment, the obvious answer was to become a genuine anti-establishment party. And they already had the seeds of that with the surge of Bernie Sanders, which was, like Trump, also a threat to their power. So to really learn lessons of 2016 would have meant changing their own policies. And that would have meant, hurting their own privilege within the system that gave rise to Trump. So obviously being willing to do that, they latched on to RussiaGate. And all of a sudden, the reason Trump won was because of Russia. And the answer to ousting him was in having somebody prove it. And that was disastrous. So what could be a bigger gift to Trump than having his resistance channeled into that? And then what could be a bigger additional gift when it all collapses and he's vindicated? And now, with this investigation going on into how all this came out, there are legitimate disclosures coming out showing just the malfeasance involved in generating RussiaGate to begin with. And that will help Trump with his reelection campaign, because he'll be able to show, look what these people did to try to bring me down and subvert the will of the voters. And he can use it as an excuse. Well, the reason I wasn't able to do this was because these deep state people and Democrats were trying to bring me down. And that will resonate with people, because there was genuine intelligence officials' misconduct in starting RussiaGate and keeping it going for more than 3 years.
That was just amazing what you just described. That explains how this has been pushed and used as a distraction from the issues that the media should be talking about. And speaking of a cover-up, previously sealed FBI documents indicate actually a close contacts between Israel and the Trump campaign, and that the Mueller investigation found evidence of actually Israeli involvement, but largely redacted it. What do we know about Israeli interference in U.S. elections, and how has it not received media coverage?
Well, yeah, the only documented case of collusion between Trump and a foreign power around the election was with Israel. We learned this with Michael Flynn, where when Flynn talked to the FBI, they asked him about his conversations with the Russian ambassador Sergei Kislyak. And the first conversation that Flynn had with Kislyak was not about Russia or about Russia sanctions, which has gotten all the attention. It was about the Trump administration was trying to undermine a vote at the UN Security Council that was going to criticize Israeli settlement building. And for the first time, Obama was not going to block it. On his way out the door, the Obama administration decided to abstain on the measure. And so the Israeli government asked the Trump camp to sabotage the vote, to try to get someone else to vote against it, to veto it. So that's what Flynn did. Flynn called the Russian ambassador and asked Russia on the Trump team's behalf whether they would do that. And they tried to do this with other countries as well. They actually worked very hard. It was their top priority, according to the Wall Street Journal. And this was done based on a personal request from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And it's actually pretty serious. You're trying to undermine the official policy of the outgoing U.S. government at the world's highest international body, the UN Security Council. But it's elicited no outrage because, unfortunately, collusion with Israel is bipartisan. So even though Obama was allowing this vote, with that exception, Democrats generally are in lockstep with Trump and the Republican Republicans when it comes to Israel, as exemplified by the fact that you had many Democrats even opposing Obama at the time when he was going to let that vote pass. And so this revelation of collusion between Trump and a foreign power has elicited a collective yawn. And it just shows how hypocritical and absurd all this, hyperventilating about foreign interference and collusion is, because you see no such outrage when that collusion is with a government that Democrats are in lockstep with, even if it means trying to undermine official U.S. policy. And we recently got more documents in the Roger Stone case. It showed that he was in contact with some Israelis who were promising or who were offering help to the Trump administration, although the full nature of to the Trump campaign, although the full extent of that, at least I'm not fully familiar with it yet. I'm not sure if it's been fully redacted, but it does just show that if there was collusion, but it wasn't between Trump and Russia. It was between Trump and Israel.
Right, with Israel. And I want to talk about, excuse me, a bit of a raspy voice today. I want to talk about the Mueller report that was released last year, since that is kind of the main report that Democrats and people like Rachel Maddow and the establishment liberal, left continue to cite as their evidence, which clearly you're saying like that's actually pointing to the opposite direction. You wrote in The Nation, for more than 2 years, leading U.S. political and media voices promoted a narrative that Donald Trump conspired with or was compromised by the Kremlin, and that Special Counsel Robert Mueller would prove it. In the process, they overlooked countervailing evidence and diverted anti-Trump energies into fervent speculation and prolonged anticipation. So long as Mueller was on the case, it was possible to believe that the walls are closing in on the traitor puppet asset in the White House. The long-awaited completion of Mueller's probe and the release of his redacted report reveals this narrative and the expectations it fueled to be unfounded, which is, what I'm saying. So what did this probe find, and how did the media react to its findings?
Well, it found absolutely nothing. For all this talk about, illicit Trump-Russia contacts, there were all these leaks from intelligence officials that were then, regurgitated in media and, peddled without any skepticism whatsoever about illicit Trump-Russia contacts, senior Russian intelligence officials having talks with Trump officials. There was this giant picture of conspiracy. Even though when all the indictments came out over the course of, more than 2 years, none of them ever showed anything of this sort. And when Mueller's report finally came out, it gave us the final answer. For all the attempts to portray links and ties between Trump and Russia, there's this figure people always say about more than 100 links and connections between Trump and Russia. It's all basically, it's all propaganda. It's actually nothing. Mueller could only find only a couple instances of anybody actually acting on behalf of the Kremlin, actually interacting with anybody, actually interacting on behalf of the Trump campaign. Because, the most fundamental aspect of a conspiracy is to have contact between the two sides. If you can't prove that these two sides have even been in touch, it's hard to show that there's any kind of conspiracy. And you see that in the report. The only instances of anybody actually acting on behalf of the Trump campaign and the Kremlin interacting comes when the Russian ambassador speaks to some Trump people, which happens during a campaign. And another instance where a press assistant in the Kremlin spokesperson's office calls back Michael Cohen, Trump's lawyer, and says, sorry, we can't help you build a Trump tower in Moscow. But if you want to come to this conference we're having later on this year, like an economic conference, you're welcome to come. We can get you an invite. That's the extent of it. But yet there was all this disingenuous effort put into showing all these links and ties between Trump and Russia. And it was just basically a giant smokescreen. It was done to try to suggest that there's some sort of illicit relationship, but there was none, because the whole thing was completely baseless. And that's why none of the indictments showed any collusion between anybody actually acting on behalf of Russia and Trump. There was all just this innuendo trying to suggest there might be something there. And you get that in case after case after case. And I was pointing this out the entire time, and so were others. But because so many journalists chose to act as propaganda vehicles for RussiaGate instead of doing their job, the public got just a radically different picture.
So where the hell have all these Facebook fact checkers been this entire time? They've been so busy targeting independent media and alternative journalists. Have they done anything to fact check the mainstream media coverage of RussiaGate?
Well, that's the whole point. All these organizations and like things like the Alliance for Securing Democracy and all these projects that are now being trotted out in the name of fact checking and fighting misinformation are themselves vehicles for misinformation.
They're the ones, right?
Yeah, they're the ones, and their function is to, in the service of American elites, to basically target anybody who dissents from the establishment consensus and smear them as, acting on behalf of Russia or Iran or whatever else the official enemy of the day is. I mean, I think now with China being demonized, we're going to see a lot more of this being deployed against China, and anybody accused of deviating from the establishment will be accused of being a Chinese bot. That's what the whole function of all this is. I mean, it's just blatant, and that's why, look, this was used against everybody, including Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders went along with the RussiaGate narrative. He didn't challenge it. He didn't accurately see it as, in fact, not just a fake way to resist Trump, but also a way to resist his rise, to avoid becoming the party for Democratic elites, to avoid becoming the party of Bernie Sanders. Because, again, as I talked about earlier, like if Democratic elites had really learned the lessons of 2016, they would have embraced the genuine anti-establishment message. And that was embodied by Bernie Sanders and his movement. So instead, that's why on the eve of the Nevada caucuses, Bernie Sanders, leading in the polls, he got Russiagated. And there was this release of this story claiming that U.S. intelligence officials have concluded that Russia now intends to help Bernie Sanders. So this is the point of all this. Yeah. So this is the point of all this stuff. It's not to fight misinformation. It's to spread misinformation that drums up tensions with Russia, which is profitable for the people who fund all this stuff, including the weapons industry, and to taint dissent and paint anybody who deviates from the establishment as just simply a puppet or agent of Russia or other official enemies.
Well, when you have organizations like the Atlantic Council, which is obviously funded by NATO, funded by weapons manufacturers, pushing this kind of, they're the ones who are acting as the arbitrators of what's true and what's false online. All they're going to do, as you said, is, push this kind of narrative and attack dissent and attack anything that's going to be an alternative to that. So where does Hillary Clinton stand in all of this?
Well, Hillary Clinton's circle has just huge responsibility for this. We know from the book Shattered, which is like the definitive account of the Hillary campaign, that within hours after her loss to Trump, that the Hillary people, that Hillary and her team met, and they decided that the election was not on the up and up, and that they were going to basically blame James Comey and Russia. And so they put this into motion, and the media completely fell in line. And they kept going and going and going with this. And if Trump is reelected in 2020, I think they have primary responsibility, because what they have basically shown us is that it was more important for them to avoid accepting responsibility for their failures in 2016, and more important for them to keep their privileged positions inside the Democratic Party and U.S. system than it was to meaningfully challenge Trump. Because instead of forming a movement, based on policies and issues that help people, the Clinton people via MSNBC and CNN and the Washington Post and the New York Times kept the Russia thing front and center. And they handed Trump a big gift. And I just hope it's not enough to hand him the gift of re-election in 2020. But I think, it's not hard to foresee, given how stupid this whole thing was, but yet how much attention and time it consumes. So I think that the Clinton people have huge responsibility in all of this.
Well, that leads me to what I was going to ask you next and talk about is, the real scandal, in my opinion, and which you've been alluding to, is how this entire RussiaGate narrative has affected our democratic system and our First Amendment in terms of elections and journalism. Talk to me about the damage it's done, and how can we reverse this, if possible?
Well, RussiaGate is entirely a projection. Everything that its proponents accuse Russia of, they're in fact guilty of themselves. So look at, for example, this thing about trying to undermine our democracy.
It's always projection, right?
It's always projection. So what could be a bigger threat to our democracy and sort of sowing discord than spending over 3 years claiming that the president is a Russian agent and that Russia, via Facebook memes and hacked emails, has the ability to destroy our democracy. I mean, that's all we've heard from liberal pundits for over 3 years, that Russia is destroying. There's just this massive new piece in the Atlantic magazine, and it's called something like Putin's goal is to bring down democracy. And it's just like, it's all about how Putin is somehow going to end democracy as we know it. And it's been a constant campaign of misinformation and fear mongering, exactly what Russia is supposedly accused of doing. And of course, even if we accept just for a second that everything Russia is accused of is true, the idea that any of it could, change people's votes or threaten democracy is just a joke. I mean, if you look at the Russian social media ads that supposedly, swung the election, most of them are not even about the election. They're a bunch of juvenile memes like Buff Bernie and Jesus arm wrestling and all this other stuff. But yet we're supposed to believe that somehow impacts Americans and sows discord. Hillary Clinton even said that it convinced black people not to vote for her in Michigan. So it's just like it's U.S. elites who are the ones who are spreading misinformation and undermining confidence in our democracy. And it's also turned, liberals, not that some liberals weren't already this way, but it's turned many more liberals into McCarthyites, where, everything is the fault of Russia, and, tensions with Russia are encouraged, to the point where you have in Trump, in reality, a Russia hawk when it comes to his policies. I mean, forget however Trump feels personally about Russia. I mean, it's obvious that he has some, affinity for Vladimir Putin, and he talked about cooperating with Russia when he came into office, and which I think was one of the few positive things about Trump, that plus his openness to peace in North Korea. But look what the Democrats' response to that is. It's, not only are they opposed to that, but they're basically accusing Trump of being soft on Russia, which means that you're challenging a hawkish president from the right. Because in reality, when I say that Trump is hawkish on Russia, I mean that his policies are far more hawkish against Russia than even Obama was. And Obama already was a hawk, but Trump has torn up vital nuclear deals. He's threatening the last remaining nuclear treaty, the New START treaty, which is the last remaining limitation on nuclear stockpiles of the U.S. and Russia. He is trying to overthrow Russia's ally, Venezuela. He's trying to stop construction of a really important gas pipeline between Russia and Germany. He has increased U.S. military war games on Russia's borders. He got NATO to spend more money on the military. He sent weapons to Ukraine that Obama refused to do because Obama didn't want to arm neo-Nazis and further inflame a proxy war that his administration basically started in Ukraine. So you have Trump in reality being a dangerous anti-Russia hawk. And what are Democrats doing? They're encouraging him to be even more hawkish by accusing him of being too soft. So it's like what this has done for democracy, and also just for the prospects of like our planet surviving, has just been it's scary. It's genuinely scary.
I mean, this whole interview so far, this conversation has exposed really what this entire narrative has been about, which is to deflect and distract from the real issues that we should be covering within media. And I want to talk about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and how I know that Assange hasn't been in the media lately, but you at the Gray Zone, not you specifically, but at the Gray Zone, you guys recently uncovered a lot of, this like spying operation taking place by the CIA on Julian Assange. But how is Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, how did they play a role in, the media attacking independent journalism and targeting like organizations like the Gray Zone, Mint Press? I mean, we were targeted right after the 2016 election and suppression, putting us on like these blacklists of like Russian bots.
because we were sourcing a lot of these leaks that were coming out of WikiLeaks showing Hillary Clinton, corruption within the Hillary Clinton campaign. So how has WikiLeaks and Assange played a role in this whole narrative of RussiaGate?
Well, I mean, this is a example of how RussiaGate has pushed liberal culture to the right. So, there was a time when WikiLeaks was, they weren't celebrated fully. They've always been attacked. But there was a recognition that they had published some important stuff, especially the Iraq war logs. And, those are very damning for the Bush administration. And there was, WikiLeaks was cited often in liberal media, and it even partnered with media outlets because it's what it revealed was just so explosive. But since 2016, there's been this effort to blame Assange for Trump's victory. I do think that the emails that were released were embarrassing for Hillary Clinton. I don't think they were particularly explosive. I mean, they showed how the DNC was biased against Bernie Sanders, but everybody already kind of knew that. And they also showed that Hillary Clinton was saying one thing in public, but then saying another thing privately to Wall Street, which people also already kind of knew anyway. So it's not as if I think you can even make the case that these emails were like that bombshell that they swung an election. But let's say they had an impact. I mean, I'm sure they influenced some voters. But this was used to basically blame WikiLeaks entirely for Trump, which is just pretty ridiculous. And then further basically criminalize and taint everything that WikiLeaks does, which is expose the secrets of the powerful, not just Democrats, but Republicans too. And you've seen that. You've seen this huge campaign against Assange and this effort to portray what WikiLeaks does as really being in the service of Russia. And who's picked up on that? But, the far right U.S. Secretary of State, and before that, CIA Director Mike Pompeo, who in his first address as CIA Director called for a campaign against Assange. And there's been no pushback on that whatsoever from liberal elites, because they become involved in the campaign against Assange because they also don't like having the secrets of the powerful revealed, because they are the powerful. And so, now you have Max Blumenthal at the Gray Zone coming out with this explosive report, which, reveals how the CIA spied on Assange and the Ecuadorian embassy. They installed a secret surveillance system that allowed them to film him. They harassed and targeted journalists, Assange's family, his friends, other journalists. And they did this in collusion with the firm of Trump mega donor Sheldon Adelson, because it was his security company that acted as a go-between between the CIA and the Spanish security firm that conducted the monitoring inside the embassy. So this is a huge scandal, and Max goes through all the details, but yet it gets no outrage whatsoever because Democrats are on board with targeting Assange.
Well, he's been dehumanized for so long.
He's been totally dehumanized. And by the way, dehumanized citing material that comes now we know directly from the CIA, because some of the surveillance, some of the surveillance footage and details of it have come from this Spanish firm that was actually spying on Assange on the CIA's behalf. So you have the media literally publishing CIA propaganda. And the irony of it is that all this was going on, the CIA working with Sheldon Adelson and sabotaging Assange. While all this was happening, what were MSNBC and CNN and, New York Times and Washington Post pundits doing? They were confidently speculating that there really was a secret WikiLeaks Trump conspiracy, and that like Roger Stone and Randy Credico was the back channel. And they're still doing that. When in reality, what was actually happening? Well, the Trump administration was spying on Assange, trying to undermine his asylum, and doing so in collusion, not with a Russian oligarch, but with an American oligarch, Sheldon Adelson. And it just shows not just how stupid RussiaGate is, but how toxic it is, because it incentivizes this push to the right, where when the Trump administration in reality is doing something so brazen and immoral as spying on Julian Assange, now RussiaGate incentivizes liberals to look away because it undermines this convenient narrative, this fantasy that they've latched onto, that Trump and WikiLeaks are actually secretly in cahoots.
Well, and everything leads back to these intelligence agencies, right? These very corrupt intelligence agencies, including Robert Mueller. I can never pronounce his last name, Mueller. He, if we look at even his background in terms of like his investigation and leading like the anthrax investigations, there was so much corruption and so many agendas at play and conflict of interest at play. Talk to me about the trust in intelligence and how we're, like you said, the liberal left is being moved to the right to trust the establishment. Where is the intelligence agencies today? Where do they stand?
Well, yeah, this has been another huge function of RussiaGate, which is to push liberals into worshiping national security state officials instead of being skeptical of them, and taking our eyes off of all the ways these people actually undermine our security and undermine a healthy society. So take Mueller. I mean, Mueller, his career includes going before Congress and helping the Bush administration peddle the Iraqi WMD scam. He, after 9/11, he oversaw the rounding up of hundreds of Muslim immigrants and putting them in basically detention camps. He gutted the number of financial prosecutors and agents investigating Wall Street after 9/11, which meant that when the financial crash happened in 2007, 2008, the FBI had almost no one left to be able to investigate this stuff. And I think he plays a very overlooked role in why there was so little prosecutions, because simply so many agents were moved over to terrorism after 9/11 and were no longer looking at Wall Street. So you can, and then there's his handling of the anthrax investigation too. So this guy has a terrible career, but yet all of a sudden he becomes the symbol of anti-Trump resistance after 2016. It's like, to underscore just how right-wing that is. I mean, during Mueller's testimony in July 2019, which, by the way, exposed just what a disaster it was to rely on him to bring Trump down, because in reality, he seemed to have very little awareness of his own investigation and humiliated himself and humiliated the RussiaGators. But there's a moment where he's asked, do you agree with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo when he calls WikiLeaks a hostile non-state intelligence service? And Mueller, without hesitating, said yes. So it was so striking that the symbol of the anti-Trump resistance is in total lockstep with the Trump administration in demonizing a publisher who wants to expose the crimes of the powerful. I mean, to me, that moment said it all there. And that's been the function here. John Brennan, you have him. He spied on the Senate when he was investigating torture. He then lied about it to cover it up. He was there when the CIA was, doing the Iraqi WMD scam. He played a key role in the U.S. assassination program, played a critical role in the proxy war in Syria. But yeah, what happens to him? He becomes a liberal hero, and now he's a commentator on MSNBC, which is one whole other aspect of this, where the media just abandoned any sense of independence and literally had, a parade of intelligence officials acting as its analysts, which is crazy enough to begin with. But what makes it even more crazy is not only are they analyzing the news, which is bad enough in itself, now they're analyzing news that they themselves are responsible for. So they're basically covering themselves. So It's like, it really has been dystopian. But, that's what happens when you cling onto a Cold War chauvinistic conspiracy theory as your means of resisting Donald Trump.
Well, these are basically like Bush era neocons, Bush era racists, Bush era like extremists, right? They're just back out in the open, and now they're being put on a pedestal by Democrats. I mean, the way you described it was so accurate. I want to go back to the Russian troll farms and Facebook ads. I saw an interview with you on Jimmy Dore, and I just was literally dying laughing when you were describing these Russian troll farms and Facebook ads. How do they even compare to more serious foreign influence campaigns on social media by countries like, Saudi Arabia or Israel?
Well, they don't compare. I mean, first of all, I think to begin with, the panic about social media ads and retweets and bots has been vastly overblown. I see it all as kind of like it's fear mongering. To me, the much more dangerous propaganda is the propaganda we get every day from our own media, and in the stories when we hear from our intelligence officials and politicians. But taking it seriously for a second, all you have to do is look at the content of the Russian troll farm and what they put out. The Senate's own studies on this show that only a small percentage of the Russian social media ads were even about the 2016 election. Most of the content had nothing to do with the election. And most of it was silly memes. Like, I mentioned one earlier, Buff Bernie. And there's an ad for a fake Jesus masturbation help hotline where if you're having, it's aimed at people with masturbation issues. And there's a line where you see Jesus. There's a picture where you see Jesus consoling a young man. And it says, if you're having problems with masturbation, reach out to Jesus and we'll beat it together. And we're supposed to believe that this somehow duped Americans into voting for Donald Trump. I mean, it's a joke. It's laughable. And what is amazing is that the industry that profits off of RussiaGate and is paid to peddle it, they have to take all this and turn this into something serious. So, that Jesus hotline ad is literally, it's listed inside the Senate report on this, which was done by this firm called New Knowledge. And New Knowledge in its report, and this has the Senate's imprint, lists that masturbation hotline ad as an example of the Russians trying to exploit Americans' vulnerabilities and find recruits. It's a parody. It's a parody. But there was so much propaganda put into convincing us that this was a serious Russian propaganda operation. By the way, Mueller disingenuously suggested, without outright saying it because he couldn't, but he strongly suggested that this Russian troll farm was a part of a Russian government propaganda campaign to elect Trump. But he had to admit in court that actually there was no connection at all that he could find between the Russian troll farm and the Russian government. And ultimately, he ended up his prosecutors recently abandoned their case against the troll farm after the troll farm challenged it in court. And laughably, the DOJ prosecutor said that, if they proceeded with the case, that the discovery process would jeopardize national security because this troll farm was fighting back and actually trying to get the evidence that Mueller's prosecutors had against them. And the Mueller team said, rather than going ahead with that, going to trial, they were going to drop the case because it would jeopardize national security, which is just so laughable. And it shows just how baseless this case was and how it was a part of an effort not to go after anything real or any real threat, but to present this narrative of this, Russian enemy trying to undermine our democracy. And so it was all entirely an exercise in fear mongering and propaganda. And at least among liberals, it was pretty successful.
And Aaron, you have obviously been covering this for a long time since this whole RussiaGate nonsense has erupted. And for independent journalists and watchdog journalists in particular, it almost feels like we're talking to a wall in terms of like presenting this evidence and saying, this is all nonsense, question more, don't believe what the establishment is saying. Even when we present evidence like you have been doing a really fantastic job at presenting evidence, following the hearings, dissecting these things, pointing out how in public these people are saying one thing, but behind, in these Senate hearings or congressional hearings, they're saying something completely different. Yet most people still believe about this collusion. So how do we go from here? Where do we go from here?
Well, look, we can't control much beyond what we own. Like, we can't control really anything beyond what we do ourselves. So all we can do is do our best to try to reach people. And, we're, especially those of us in alternative independent media, we're up against a giant machine, far bigger than anything that we'll ever be a part of. So all we can do is do our best and hope that people find it and fight back against, smear campaigns and censorship attempts and everything else that is done to try to marginalize us. And, with progressives and, I hope there's a lesson learned here, which is that, a lot of people, not just elite liberals, but, a lot of progressives and progressive media outlets too got swept up in this. And the reason to me is pretty obvious. It's not because, everybody is corrupt like, DNC elites are, but because this was a comforting narrative for many people. This was presented to us as the thing that was going to not just explain Trump's victory, but also reverse it. It would bring Trump down. And for many people, that was understandably appealing. But the lesson is, I think, for people is that, we can't get swept up in things just because they're comforting. And also, I think progressives really have to think about how this was actually not, as I alluded to earlier, this was not just something that was done to resist Trump in a false way. It was also done to help avoid becoming, on the Democratic side, a genuine progressive force, which is what should have happened after 2016. So, there could be a real alternative to Trump, and us no longer, relying on neoliberal centrists as personified by Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. And so for the progressives who got swept up in pushing RussiaGate, they actually got swept up in something that was being used to undermine what they really believe in. And, we saw that come to fruition when, as we talked about earlier, Bernie Sanders got RussiaGated as he was surging on the eve of Nevada shortly before Super Tuesday. I mean, there's a reason why that happened. It's because Bernie Sanders represented a threat to the wing of the party behind RussiaGate, and who used RussiaGate to protect its own power. And so there's hopefully a lesson there that progressives should be wary of narratives that might look convenient, but are actually ultimately used for toxic reasons, including being used to destroy progressives, as RussiaGate has actually been pretty effective in, because it's 4 years later, and who is our nominee for the Democrats? It's Joe Biden from the Hillary Clinton wing of the party.
Joe freaking Biden, I know.
Yeah, and there's been no discussion about what led to Trump's victory. It's all been about Russia, and that is an achievement of the RussiaGators. It really is. That's exactly what I think they intended, and they succeeded in that respect. And it's our job as progressives, for those of us who can define ourselves that way, to no longer tolerate that.
Well, and it goes for the same, as you mentioned, for any sort of narrative that's being presented by the media, whether it's war narratives, social justice issues, interventions. I know you've done a lot of coverage about Syria and some of the intelligence that have come out about like chemical weapons attack, and we'll leave that conversation for another day. But we do have to question more. We do have to hold our elected officials and our media accountable. The media that we have today does not represent we the people anymore. It's owned and managed by the very entities that the media should actually be holding accountable. Thank you, Aaron, for joining us today. You can find Aaron's reporting about RussiaGate at The Gray Zone and at The Nation. That's a wrap for today's Mintcast. This program is 100% listener supported. You can join the hundreds of financial supporters and sponsors who make this show possible by becoming a member on our Patreon page. We'll see you next week.